I remember correctly, you've had so many wonderful leadership roles at AAL. Can you share a little bit more, teasing out what Ross brought up, the evolution of not only AAL, but of you over that time frame, and what are some of the things that you wanted to share with this audience from that perspective?
So my origin story to AAL is kind of funny. I am a biodefense scientist by training. I have a PhD in molecular genetics and microbiology. And between my PhD and my postdoc, I spent a decade studying emerging zoonotic infections and doing animal models and vaccine design. I've worked with the plague, I've worked with tuberculosis, tularemia, and the now famous hantavirus. I worked with that before it was in the news. That meant I wore the spacesuits, I had the air hose, I was in biosafety level 3 and 4 with no air, no water, having to take 5 showers a day every time I left the lab. It's great. I watched a lot of clinical trials fail, but they didn't really fail. That was the struggle. Our diseases were so rare, you couldn't run a standard clinical trial. What you'd have to do is show that they worked in animals, and then show that they were safe and had an equivalent response in humans. And if they did, you could get licensed under animal rule. Well, we showed they worked in animals, were safe in humans, mounted an immune response, but it wasn't quite as strong as the animals, and then you're left in limbo because you can't get your animal rule license. And these vaccines may work, we just don't know. So I decided I wanted more immediacy to my science. I decided I wanted a little bit more variety because I didn't want to spend 2 to 3 decades making a vaccine and then have it fail. I'm also an Army spouse. I am married to an infantry officer. And he was coming down to Texas to take command at Fort Cavazos. And I said, well, we're married and I do like you, so we should probably move together. And AAL was hiring at the time. So I called them up and I said, I hear you guys are hiring scientists. And they looked at me and they said, we're hiring engineers. And I told them that was a very valid point. But if they ever wanted to experiment on soldiers, they needed somebody who knew how to do an ethics review, manage the IRB process. I'd done that for a clinical trial. So they hired me. And 5 years and 5 jobs later, I became the director, having done 0 IRBs.
He's 2.5 Cav, by the way. Shoot him in the face if you're familiar with that unit. Yes. Sorry, that's a little.
So that's how I came to this, which means I do bring a scientist background of I want numbers, I want data in a field that is largely qualitative. Yes, I did run p-values on some of the metrics in my annual report this year. No, none of them were statistically significant. I had a p equals 0.052. Come on, it was really close. So what lessons have I learned? I've learned that it's okay to be an outsider. Like, I brought a really weird perspective to this. I'd never worked with industry. I'd never worked with venture capital. And my time in defense was really like academic biology. So I had to be willing to learn. I had to be willing to ask a lot of questions when I didn't know something. And sometimes people take that to mean you're challenging them, and that's not what I was doing. But sometimes it also means you discover ways to hack the system because you question the system because you're trying to learn it. I think I also discovered, well, I know I also discovered that hiring a team of people that can translate is the most important thing you can do. The question we ask all of our scientists when they come in is describe your work to a non-scientist. If they can do that without jargon, they're in. But if they resort to, well, you see there's IL-5 and then it does this and I'm going to run this type of test and this assay, not going to work. Because I figure if you can translate your science, I can teach you how to translate corporate, I can teach you how to translate military. So those are my big things. Don't be afraid to be an outsider and be really good at taking all the jargon out of what you do and explaining it to somebody who has no clue what you're doing. Because you're going to have to communicate to a soldier or to an acquisition professional who doesn't necessarily speak the technology language that you have.
And possibly Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I do that too.
Yeah. Please,
Can I just add one thing? So her husband, which she didn't say because she is very low key, was one of our strategists as an infantryman. That's kind of weird, I know, for some. But he was one of our strategists and helped write the blueprint for Army Futures Command when I was at Army Futures Command Task Force Chief of Staff. So before it became a command, this guy helped write what the command should look like and what it should do. And you can imagine it's the largest reorganization of the Army since 1973.
You can imagine our dinner table
Yeah.
conversations.
So most of us were not born in 1973. I, for one, can say that. Maybe I can't. But he was really the mastermind. So I met Casey at a lot of our social functions and didn't understand, just like I didn't understand what she just said, didn't understand what she said then because she was so smart. And then here she is running AAL. That's what it takes to really change the paradigm. Somebody that doesn't speak all DOD, I think, right? She speaks other languages other than Department of Defense. It seems like I'm her cheerleader. Mark said you need a cheerleader. Like I am their family's cheerleader, 100%.
Yeah, I just put a thought in my head I want to erase, Ross. But, to the translation point, everybody's familiar with DARPA? So the first director of DARPA used to have, I think it's 7 or 8 catechisms.
Heilmeyer's Catechisms.
There you go.
Look them up. They're really good.
They are perfect. And that's what I tell most startups, that they really make it simple. If you cannot explain it to your grandmother or your wife, foundationally, you're going to have a very difficult time. It should not be that technical. Now, you should be able to go to that degree because that's going to really progress a lot faster. But you have to start there. How simple is it and how much effects you're going to make? And so that's a good reference point for everybody trying to get into the innovation space.